There is a version of World War I that lives in textbooks, muddy, miserable, and somehow distant. Men marched, men died. But that version leaves out something extraordinary, the daily, desperate, brilliantly human act of surviving, not just in battle, but between battles, in the cold hours before dawn, in the rot and the rain. This episode of Fieldcraft Chronicles tears away the myth and steps into the mud itself, because what those soldiers figured out amounts to one of the most intensive crash courses in fieldcraft and bushcraft the modern world has ever witnessed. The trench as a living environment, and the myth of simple misery. Mention the trenches, and most people picture a uniform hellscape. That image is not wrong, but it is dangerously incomplete. The Western Front stretched over 700 kilometers, and no two sections were alike. Dense clay that held water like a bowl, chalk downs that drained cleanly, German lines deliberately engineered on higher ground for drainage and sight lines. The smell was its own assault, wet earth, cordite, decay. The sound was relentless, artillery that never fully ceased, the crack of a sniper's rifle, and beneath it all, men talking, laughing, cooking. That capacity to find routine in the extraordinary was not weakness. It was survival psychology at its most sophisticated. Makeshift shelter, engineering survival from nothing. The myth says soldiers dug a hole and lived in it. The reality is that trench construction was an evolving science driven by brutal trial and error. Timber revetting, walls lined with salvaged planks and ammunition crates, was not optional. Without it, walls wept and slumped after rain, burying men alive. Dugouts cut into trench walls used corrugated iron, packed sandbags, and scavenged beams, some descending 6 meters below surface. Sandbag technique was an art filled 2/3 full, tied end inward, rows staggered like brickwork. These methods were never in any 1914 manual. They were learned in the mud and passed between men who were practicing bushcraft with their lives. Food, water, and the myth of the well-supplied soldier. Official rations looked reasonable on paper. What arrived at the front, cold, mud-contaminated, always late, was something else. Soldiers built smokeless stoves from biscuit tins packed with whale oil-soaked earth to heat water and warm tinned beef without drawing a sniper. A hot meal in a cold trench was not comfort. It was the difference, in many accounts, between a man who could face the next day and one who could not. Water was equally critical. The shell-pocked landscape was saturated with contamination. Drinking from craters was a slow death sentence. Men tracked birds and insects to find clean sources, treated water with iodine or improvised salts, and rigged canvas sheets to collect rain. Techniques as old as survival itself, reinvented under fire. Camouflage and concealment, the art of disappearing. Now, the myth is that First World War camouflage was, well, rather primitive, but the reality is it actually gave birth to the modern science of concealment. French artists, many of them post-impressionists, believe it or not, were recruited to design disruption patterns, teaching everyone that breaking an outline matters far more than simply matching a color. A soldier up against brown mud was still visible if his helmet cast a perfect silhouette against the sky. The fix? Hessian netting, mud applied in patches, and vegetation changed every day to match the microterrain. German snipers, meanwhile, used papier-mâché dummy heads and fake tree stumps built overnight out in no man's land. British sniper schools taught stillness over speed, timing movement to the wind and artillery, reading shadow with the attention of a seasoned tracker. These are not just military relics. They're the foundations of every modern scout and stalker. Hygiene and health, the battle no one talks about. More men died of disease in the First World War than in any previous modern conflict. The units with the highest survival rates were, quite simply, those with the most disciplined field hygiene. Trench foot, the slow destruction of feet by cold water immersion, was entirely preventable with whale oil and dry sock rotation, a fact proved by British medical officers and, unfortunately, ignored at enormous cost. In any wet, cold environment, dry feet are a survival priority. Latrines were positioned to drain away from water and food, and lime sourced from rubble served as disinfectant. These were not comfortable lessons. They were the kind of marginal, desperate knowledge that separates the man who walks out of the wilderness from the one who does not. Moral and psychological fieldcraft, the survival of the mind. Fieldcraft is never only physical. Morale in the trenches was sustained not by patriotism, but by small rituals, dark humour, improvised music, regimental pets, and of course the cellular bond between men who had shared extremity. These were not distractions from survival. They were survival. Routine, even an invented one, was a psychological anchor in an environment whose only natural rhythm was death. Modern survival psychology has validated this again and again. In isolation and extreme stress, any maintained routine preserves function longer than any other intervention. The men who let routine collapse were the ones who stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped cleaning their weapons, and eventually stopped surviving. The enduring lessons, what the trenches left us. The men who survived the trenches were not simply the luckiest. They were the most adaptive, treating knowledge from any source as a resource as vital as ammunition. The myths say they merely suffered. The reality says they learned. And what they learned about shelter, water, food, concealment, hygiene, and the psychology of endurance applies as directly to the bushcrafter heading into the backcountry as to anyone preparing for the unexpected. The earth still gets wet. The body still needs heat, water, and calories. The mind still needs routine. Nothing fundamental about human survival has changed. These forgotten men were our teachers. The least we can do is learn. If this episode moved you, if it taught you something you didn't know, or reframed something you thought you did, then share it. Share it with the history enthusiast in your life. Share it with the bushcrafter, the prepper, the scout leader, the teacher. This knowledge belongs to everyone who values self-reliance, historical truth, and the enduring art of survival. Subscribe to Fieldcraft Chronicles so you never miss an episode, and join a community of people who believe that the best preparation for the future is a deep, honest understanding of the past. The trenches are 100 years behind us. The lessons are as alive as ever.